How did America come to embrace same-sex marriage? Sasha Eisenberg will be here to talk about his new book, The Engagement. Can you tell the history of Hollywood in 9 books? Jim Hoberman will join us to talk about the books that best describe a very particular city and a gigantic global industry and art form. Alexandra Alter will be here with the latest in publishing news. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's June 11th. I'm Pamela Paul. Sasha Eisenberg joins us now from Santa Monica, California. He is the author of several books, including The Sushi Economy, Globalization, and the Making of a Modern Delicacy, The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns, Outpatients, The Astonishing New World of Medical Tourism, and his new book, The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. Sasha, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Let's start with something that probably not a lot of your readers will know, but you know very well, and I know, which is that this book was supposed to come out a full year ago in June 2020. And it was one of those books that was delayed by the COVID pandemic, but maybe delayed the most. What was that like?
It was tough. So it got delayed 3 times in the last year. And I think some of that was in the spring. It was a marketing consideration that with bookstores closed and no live events, a lot of publishers held their books back. And then it was supposed to come out last September. And by that point, it was sort of a manufacturing problem. As best I gathered, the publishers couldn't actually get the books out of warehouses because people were sick. I learned the hard way that book publishing facilities are basically like meatpacking plants with wood pulp. So I had a lot set up last fall and I had to put it all on hold, and here I am.
Well, it must be a big relief, if nothing else.
It is. And, I was pretty cautious in writing this book of understanding that this was a topic where it was possible events in the news could affect it, and tried to write it so that when it came out, it would be current. And I think there was some possibility that things could happen over the last year that would change that dynamic. And they really haven't in a significant way, which was useful.
You mentioned wood pulp, and there is a lot of wood pulp in this book. It's over 700 pages. I hope that won't deter people. It moves very quickly. But obviously, you did a lot of research. It must have taken some time to write. And then, of course, you had that delay in coming out. What has it been like to sit with this subject for such a long time? How long have you been working on it?
So I first had the idea for this a decade ago, and I sold the proposal in the spring of 2012. I've been living with it for 10 years, and it was about 6 years of reporting, research, and writing, and then the various things we talked about. One of the things is the subject changed, right? So, I looked back not long ago at the proposal I wrote in 2012, and I used phrases like, as the nation approaches consensus on this issue. I did not expect when I started this that there would be a Supreme Court case, let alone a series of Supreme Court cases that led to a national resolution of the legal issues, that the political issue would basically disappear as a live political issue in our politics. And so it was, in a certain way, a smaller subject, definitely a less resolved topic. And I went from feeling like I was writing a sort of historical treatment of something that was in the news to something that feels like a pretty defined chapter in our recent history.
Right. You ended up having a beginning, a middle, and an end, which you can't say about a lot of books that are on political or topical subjects these days, where it's a constantly moving target.
Yeah. And the broader arc of the book ends up being about an issue that sort of came out of nowhere, came to dominate our politics in many respects, and then has disappeared. Politicians now just aren't asked for their opinions on same-sex marriage. We don't debate it. We've moved on to other things. And so, what was from a narrative perspective, yes, it was like tidy that there was the end at the end of it. But also, I think it ends up being a really interesting study because you have this 25-year period where you basically see the invention of a political issue, its life, and its death. And that, I think, teaches us a little bit about how political forces can sort of organize around a new issue.
When you think about cultural and social change and political change, all of which this is, sometimes and very often it's a kind of, straight, slow growing momentum trajectory in one direction. And other times it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. This, to me at least, seemed like this issue moved very, very slowly and then all of a sudden really quickly. What's the accurate way to describe the resolution of this?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the sort of animating insights I had in 2011 that made me think that this was both a topic for a book and that the timing was right to do it was watching the New York State Senate vote to pass the Marriage Equality Act, which Governor Cuomo then signed into law basically immediately in the summer of 2011. That was the first time that having been a political journalist over the decade prior, it was the first time I was sort of convinced that I knew how this was going to end. I think there was a real open question for a number of years. Massachusetts legalized a same-sex marriage in 2004. There were marriage activists who seriously feared that they could lose marriage in Massachusetts if a constitutional amendment passed. And, in that scenario, we might look back at this as this maybe akin to Reconstruction, but this brief experiment that then sort of got taken away with backlash. I also thought maybe what was likely was we'd end up in a situation sort of like the death penalty, which was its own, probably the most divisive cultural social topic in the United States for a period in the 1990s. And we've basically reached stasis around it. Roughly half the states have the death penalty. Roughly half the states don't have the death penalty. Every few years, one moves from one column to another, but we don't talk about it much. Politicians aren't challenged on it the way they once were. And it's possible to imagine that as a place where the marriage debate would have ended up. What happened in the years sort of between 2010 and 2015 was that you had a sort of dramatic political shift. Public opinion, elites like Barack Obama most famously, changing their views to get in line with public opinion, it being demonstrated in state ballot measures that this could actually win when put before voters. And as it happens, conservatives had made what in retrospect looks like a major strategic error in the 1990s by taking what naturally would be a local issue, a state level issue over who could get married, and making it through the Defense of Marriage Act, something that was in the federal code, and thus the Supreme Court might have to take on as a constitutional question. And that's what allowed for the sort of tidy resolution, is that this could be settled by 9 justices and not by our very messy state-level political processes.
Okay, let's go back to a couple of the key points, the key moments that you mentioned. New York State passed that marriage bill in 2011. Obama reversed his position shortly thereafter. And there's kind of a distinction to be made, because sometimes people change their mind and sometimes they change their political position, and occasionally they changed both. Obama was one of them. Another one, interestingly, that you talk about a little bit later on is Rob Portman. Talk about why he was so important.
So Rob Portman, it's in the spring of 2013 as the first marriage cases are headed to the Supreme Court. And just a couple weeks before, he gives an interview to CNN and writes an op-ed in some Ohio paper saying that he had changed his position on the issue. He was always a fairly moderate Republican who was more interested in budget issues, not a kind of culture warrior. But he had been within the mainstream of his party on LGBT issues. But he had a son who came out as gay. And as he wrote rather movingly, like, that changed his views about not just gay rights issues, but about what marriage meant from the perspective of a family member. And it was illustrative of the way in which I think a lot of public opinion moved in this country, which is, it was always the best predictor of support, not just for marriage, but other gay rights issues. The survey question, do you have a coworker, family member, or friend who's gay or lesbian? And, when that first got asked in the late 1970s, the number was pretty close to 0, and now it's pretty close to 100. And political opinions have moved alongside that. But Portman ends up in the political sphere driving elite opinion, not among his fellow Republicans, but among Democrats, because it becomes instantly impossible for a Senate Democrat to be to the right of a Republican on this issue. And so what you see is that, over the course of just a couple of weeks, basically every Democrat in Congress gets asked about this regularly, and they all announce that they now support same-sex marriage too.
Who are some of the key people who reversed their position at that time on the Democratic side of the Senate?
Claire McCaskill is a great example of that, a cautious politician who comes from a conservative-leaning state. She was perfectly fine up until that moment. It went from being that the politically safe place to be for a moderate Democrat was opposed to same-sex marriage, and then immediately, once Rob Portman got on the other side of her, then she had to switch. Interestingly, since he's in the news, I'll note that there are only 2 Democratic senators who got through that period post-Portman without changing their positions on them. One of whom is Mark Pryor, who's no longer in the Senate. The other is Joe Manchin, who, by all accounts, still to this day is opposed to same-sex marriage, but as is illustrative of the turn this issue has taken, nobody ever asks him about it anymore.
One of the big players opposing same-sex marriage was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. How unified was the movement against gay marriage, and to what extent was it religiously motivated and organized?
Before 1993, there was hardly anyone who was opposed to same-sex marriage in the United States, just like there was hardly anybody who was for same-sex marriage in the United States. And that changed with the court decision in Hawaii, where the state Supreme Court becomes the first court on earth to recognize that the fundamental right to marriage could extend to same-sex couples. And the Mormon Church is the first institution in the United States of any significance to fully appreciate the gravity of that state Supreme Court decision.
That decision, that Bear versus Lewin, what year was that?
1993. And so the church had always had a significant footprint in Hawaii because of historical missionary work that it did there. And they start organizing to try to effectively defeat this legal decision through the political process. And they go in, put a lot of money, detail some fairly prominent figures, including Ronald Reagan's former pollster, Dick Wirthlin, who are sent on mission to do political work in favor of this, and create a coalition with the local Catholic Archdiocese of Honolulu. And the Mormons are very savvy about their politics, and that is that they're willing to throw a lot of resources into places where they can have an impact, but they also have a keen view of how they are seen by the broader population. And they understand that if the face of this political movement in Hawaii is Mormon, that will make it very difficult to build the relationships with legislators that they need. And so the effective deal that they strike with the Catholic Church is that the Catholics will be the face of this. The Mormons will offer a lot of the money and expertise behind it. And we see that a version of that formulation again during Proposition 8 in California in 2008, where at that point, you have a coalition of it's sort of spurred along by some evangelical pastors in San Diego, but ultimately it's the Catholic Church, especially through the San Francisco and San Diego Archdiocese, and with tons of money from both institutional and individual Mormon sources. And one thing about Mormons is they have a lot of experience knocking on doors and talking about tough issues. And so they were a sort of exceptional base to build a field operation for a statewide ballot contest.
Okay, so on one side, you have a very well-organized, politically savvy, lots of money, religious opposition. Who's on the other side?
So the coalitions started to grow. And one thing that you see is, in Hawaii early on, you have the fairly small gay and lesbian community in Hawaii, the ACLU, some national gay organizations. At that point, some Democratic politicians are actively opposed to same-sex marriage. Over the course of the next decade, you have 35 states that have statewide ballot measures. And the coalition, the pro-same-sex marriage coalition, starts to expand to include labor unions, other non-gay civil rights groups. And that is both, a huge opportunity for gay rights activists, but also poses a challenge because you end up with these committees where there are so many stakeholders in them trying to come up with a message that the NAACP and the auto workers and the Bar Association and the libertarians from the Cato Institute can all get behind, since they're all decision makers on this committee. And the lowest common denominator messaging is almost always some version of don't mess with our Constitution, which is just so emotionally inert compared to what the opposition is doing, which at this point is some version of this is going to either turn your children gay, or schools are going to have to teach that gay marriage is all right, or your kids are going to come home and ask you, because they heard at school today, that Heather has two mommies or whatever, to explain this to them. And one of the challenges that gay marriage activists faced in the wake of their defeat in Proposition 8 was figuring out how to refine their message. And some of it was building a structure that got beyond the kind of broad coalition politics that had prevailed in these states.
All right, let's talk about the moment this ends on June 26th, 2015. Talk about the decision itself and remind us who was on the court at that time. And was this a foregone conclusion? Did they know this was going to pass?
Anthony Kennedy was the swing vote on the court, and this was the third in a series of major gay rights opinions that he had written starting in 1996. And by that point, it was this very unusual, I think, in American history, confluence of being a landmark court decision that was also seen as, at that point, completely foregone. And a number of district courts had struck down state bans on same-sex marriage, and they had been upheld at the district level. And when those cases got appealed over the course of 2014 to the Supreme Court didn't want to hear any of those cases, which, permitted the states in many cases to start marrying same-sex couples, but also created a huge problem if the court was later going to come in and try to overturn those decisions, since you now would have tens of thousands of couples who had married under the new regime. And the court does not like to be a source of, regardless of ideology, the justices do not like to be a sort of source of uncertainty and chaos in American life. And after they had allowed all those lower court rulings to stand, it seemed very hard that they were going to come in at a later date and overturn them. And so the question became not, is the court going to rule that there is a fundamental right to marriage for same-sex couples and overturn all of the state bans that still existed, but how was that opinion going to be written? What was its breadth going to be? And effectively, was this going to be written as an opinion about marriage, or was this going to be written as a gay rights or LGBT rights opinion? And there were sort of two ways at it. And Kennedy, who always, a Republican appointed justice, conservative in many respects, had always been very skeptical about sort of traditional civil rights jurisprudence. And he ultimately wrote this as a marriage case about the institution of marriage, what it would mean for gays and lesbians, what it means for them to have been excluded, for children of those couples to be excluded. But he did not write this, as many gay activists came to hope he would, as a case about how sexual minorities should be treated under civil rights law. And what that meant was that the impact of this was circumscribed entirely to state marriage laws. And it's part of the reason that we're having the debates we're having now about trans rights, and why there's still a push in Congress to pass the Equality Act for basic non-discrimination protections, because the court chose, in a certain way, the language was inspiring, but the legal reasoning was very narrow in particular.
When it comes to Supreme Court decisions on very divisive issues, even when there is a major decision that seems to settle it once and for all, we know that that's not always the case. Prime example, obviously, is Roe v. Wade. Is this settled and done? I mean, is there any danger that this could be reversed, undermined?
I think it's really hard to imagine a circumstance in which the central holding of Obergefell, which is that same-sex couples have a right to marry under the U.S. Constitution, could be overturned. What we are seeing is efforts to define religious liberty exemptions in a way that could limit who has to recognize those marriages. There's a case that went before the Supreme Court about a Colorado baker who did not want to make a wedding cake for a married gay couple. There's now a case that's before the court now that they'll probably rule on this month about whether a Catholic social service agency has to place foster children with same-sex couples. And I think that we could see sort of years of pushing the envelope to see how far a conservative court would go, and maybe a few years from now, they're hearing cases where an employer says that, that the religious beliefs of its owners mean that medical and health insurance should be extended to opposite sex spouses of their employees, but not to same sex spouses of their employees. And so I think you could end up not really getting at the core of Obergefell, but dramatically changing the place that the institution of civil marriage has in American life if all sorts of private actors are basically given permission to disregard it if it goes contrary to their beliefs.
There's a movement right now with storytelling where some people question whose right it is to tell a certain story. And you yourself are in heterosexual marriage. Did you ever think at any point, like, this isn't my story to tell? Or did you get any resistance from people you were interviewing or talking to as part of your research along those lines?
I had people who asked questions about my personal life that I think at the beginning of interviews were more than just idle small talk. I was not married at the time. I got married. It turns out if you take 10 years to write a book, a lot can change, including not just with marriage nationally. So I was straight and single when I started this book. And I did get the sense that people were trying to politely feel out where I was coming from on this. I was sort of conscious of the idea that people would sort of interrogate what right I had to tell this story, and I saw this not as just a LGBT history story, but very much a story about a national debate that came to engulf the whole country. It's a story not just about the people who fought for the right to marry, people who opposed the right to marry, and people who changed their minds. And I did not want it to be received as just a matter of LGBT history. And I think that maybe in some respect made me feel comfortable that I had standing to tell it.
Well, civil rights is everyone's story. I want to ask about one final thing, which is there was an interesting story recently in the New Yorker by the writer Andrew Solomon that looked at marriage, a new frontier in marriage rights around polygamy and polyamorists and this kind of unexpected alliance between Mormon or offshoots of Mormonism, polygamists and polyamorists, and this question of does gay marriage set precedent for being married to more than one person? I'm curious what you think. Does that feel like that could be a kind of next debate in terms of marriage rights?
It certainly could be. I mean, I think one thing that's also happened, though, over the course of this debate is it has fully enshrined marriage as the sort of gold standard of relationships. There was an active debate that I chronicle in the 1980s within the gay and lesbian community, mostly among lawyers and legal theorists, about whether marriage was something worth fighting for, whether it was actually a desirable goal for the gay rights movement. And you had folks who came from a sort of liberationist background, folks, primarily lesbians, who had been informed by sort of second wave feminist thinking about marriage as a patriarchal, heteronormative institution. And they argued that the goal of gay rights family law should be to, what they sometimes called multiple families, to create a legal regime in which a wide spectrum of family types were treated equally. And that could be couples of any gender or sex combination, but also single parents, multiple partner setups, communal living, co-parent adoption, like everything should be treated the same under the law, and there should be no benefits or privileges that are extended to just one type of family arrangement. And what has happened as gay rights opponents focused on this issue, it unified the gay and lesbian community about fighting for marriage rights. And what they have done ultimately is help to enshrine, both in the legal process and in American culture, a sense that marriage is a unique institution. And the language they use to talk about it, about love and commitment, is so particular, I think, to the dynamic between two people that in a certain respect, marriage is a more central institution in American life now than it was 30 years ago because we went through this political fight over it. And I don't know whether the sort of feelings that extend to marriage will naturally translate to versions of it that don't have the essential codependence of two people at its heart.
All right. Well, let's end on the note of love. It's June. It's Pride Month. It's also a very popular month for weddings. It's the month in which the Supreme Court decision was made legalizing gay marriage. And it's the month of the publication of this long in the works book. Sasha, congratulations again. The book is The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage.
Thank you, Pamela.
Tina Jordan joins us now to help celebrate the 125th anniversary of the book review. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So today I'm going to talk about the bestseller list, which actually goes back, I think, a lot further than you would imagine. In fact, decades before the book review was even born, the newspaper was really interested in what books were selling. And there were often reporters whose regular beats involved walking around to the city's individual stores to see what was selling. On October 31st, 1896, which was just the third issue of the book review, it reprinted the bestseller list collected by a literary journal called The Bookman. And that was just the first of many. There's a brief period of time where it published the bestseller lists curated by Publishers Weekly, for example, and even later, Baker and Taylor. But before all that, and before it had figured out a way to create its own bestseller list, it kept finding new and different ways to report on what books were selling. And part of that involved writing about what the most checked out books at libraries were. I mean, for years, the book review ran a regular weekly segment called Most Checked Out Books at the New York Public Library. In 1901, it started a regular column called Books in Demand, in which basically a reporter went out and interviewed librarians and booksellers about most requested titles. And finally, the very first official New York Times Book Review bestseller list appeared on August 9th, 1942. And it actually looked a lot different than the bestseller list does today. It was divided into fiction and nonfiction, and it then was a chart split into cities so you could see what the bestsellers were in Boston, in Atlanta, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, and so on. But in New York, anyway, that week, the number one novel was something called And Now Tomorrow by Rachel Field. And it's about a deaf heiress. That's all I can tell. And Elliot Paul's The Last Time I Saw Paris was number one on the nonfiction list. So there you have it.
And did we continue to publish those bestseller lists weekly from there?
We did indeed.
All right. Thanks for the look back, Tina.
Thanks, Pamela.
Jim Hoberman joins us now from New York. He is a recovering film critic and the author of Make My Day, Movie Culture in the Age of Reagan. This week, in the book review, he wrote a history of Hollywood in 9 books. So a book view of the movie industry. Jim, thanks for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
Was this a fun project to work on?
Absolutely. I mean, the hardest thing about it was narrowing down the list of books.
How many did you start with?
Well, I knew that it had to be 9, so I probably had in mind, off the top of my head, sort of about 20 books, and then began narrowing them down.
What was most painful to lose?
Well, there's one that is, I think it's going to appear online, but it's not going to be in the paper. That was a book called Hollywood's Censor by Thomas Doherty. And it was a kind of biography, or, in terms of the film industry, of Joseph I. Breen, who was the head of the production code in the 30s and 40s. And I thought this gave a fascinating look at how movies were made through the perspective of a censor of the production code. I thought that this guy probably had as much influence on the American movies of that period as anybody did. And it's not something that's generally considered. And, movies then were so integral to public opinion that this guy's mindset is invaluable to study.
One interesting thing about the choices you make here, you start with a book published in 1952, Picture by Lillian Ross, and I want to talk about that. But of course, this is a history of 20th century America. And so I have to ask, were there books that were good that were published prior to that midway point in the century about Hollywood, or was it not until then that people maybe started to write seriously about Hollywood culture and the movie business?
Oh, no, there were certainly books that were published before. I mean, one in the 20s by Terry Ramsey, movies A Billion and One Nights, which is incredibly detailed in explaining how the movie industry worked during that decade. But I wanted to start with the 50s because that's the period, in which, in a sense, the industry became self-conscious. If you think about what came out around that time, I mean, that's the year of Sunset Boulevard, where the movies sort of looked at themselves. And it's also the period in which movies were being supplanted by television. And I think that caused a degree of introspection. The period when movies were the dominant popular art form was over or was ending. And I think that that's really, when more analytical books were written, and also a number of popular ones. Part of my criterion for picking books was how enjoyable I thought they would be to read.
Some of the books are well known, I think, probably to readers still today, and a few of them are maybe slightly less well known. And you didn't pick some of the obvious books that people talk about. Like you didn't pick William Goldman, you didn't pick a few other widely read bestsellers. Was that deliberate to kind of draw attention to maybe some less well-known books?
It was part of my mindset as a film critic in looking for things that I thought might have been overlooked or were not as well known, were not necessarily bestsellers. I don't know that any of these were bestsellers. I guess Peter Biskin's book, Easy Riders, Raging Bull might have been the closest to that. But, you know, it's enjoyable for me to bring to the foreground books that may not have been as well known. And I should say that these were also all books that impressed themselves on me when I read them. So there's a personal aspect to this also.
Let's go back to that first book in chronological order on your list, Picture by Lillian Ross. I guess this is part of a subgenre of books that focus on a single movie.
Yeah, she invented the genre. I mean, it's the first example, and in some respects, it's the best. You know, she was a terrific journalist, and she practiced this kind of fly on the wall reportage, which is in itself very cinematic. You know, she got behind the scenes of this ill-fated but, you know, well-publicized production and adaptation of The Red Badge of Courage by John Huston, who is probably the American filmmaker taken most seriously in 1950. I mean, I think that it was thought that Orson Welles had self-destructed, but Huston was there and was active. And she just gets a fantastic cast of characters here. All these producers talking in addition to Huston. And, you know, it's much more interesting ultimately than the movie. And she demonstrated that the backstory could be the real story. There have been many, many, many books written about devoted to individual movies. In fact, I just finished one myself.
What was that? What's your new book?
It's a monograph on Duck Soup, the Marx Brothers comedy, which I wrote. I mean, that had been my favorite movie when I was 15, so I was happy to revisit that.
So a true passion project.
Oh, completely, yeah. But my point is that she was on the set and in the offices while this movie was being made. And the end product was not as important to her really as the process. And she made that process fascinating. She illuminated it, and it's also phenomenally well written too. So that book has a lot going for it.
It's interesting that those single movie books that Ross, as you say, invented, sometimes they're about great films. It seems more often that they were about movies that were total disasters, or maybe those are just the ones that are more well known. In this case, the movie was really neither a total hit nor a complete flop, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was. I would say it was a disappointment. It was a disappointment. There was a what would have been called then a prestige project that failed. And it also had kind of larger implications for the movie industry because, you know, MGM, the studio that produced it, had been the leading studio and was undergoing a kind of change in management. And the idea of a loss leader was still very important to Hollywood, the idea that they could make a prestige film that might not make that much money, but everything would balance out because they had their theaters and so on, so that people would have to book it. And that idea, I think, lost traction in the 1950s. So, you know, in a way, it's also a study of something which was going out of existence.
You bookend your history in 9 books here with another single film book. We'll always have Casablanca by Noah Eisenberg. Was that a deliberate choice?
Oh, yes. I wanted to bring things full circle. Also, I mean, Casablanca is, by some standards, can be considered the most successful Hollywood movie ever made, not because it necessarily made the most money or, you know, got the most Oscars, although it did make money and it did get a lot of Oscars, but because people love it so deeply. And to me, this epitomizes something, to take the title of another book, which I could have included but didn't. It epitomizes the genius of the system. There's not really any one person who made Casablanca. It's almost like a natural occurrence somehow, you know, that it would come into existence, or the whole system brought it into existence. And Eisenberg is a terrific study of the film in that context. He really goes at it in a number of ways. It's very entertaining. But again, you know, I see it as a retrospective. It's a work of history. It's about something that's not going to happen again. There's not going to be another movie like Casablanca, which I think is part of the sort of fond irony of his title. We'll always have Casablanca, you know, paraphrases. We'll always have Paris, you know, a famous line from the movie. So I like the way that brought a certain closure to the set of books, and it's a recent book too, which I like.
A number of the books that you include on your list look at politics and Hollywood, politics in Hollywood, the way in which Hollywood movies reflect politics. And I'm jumping out of order here, but I'd like to talk about three of them. They are Naming Names by Victor Navasky, the former editor of The Nation, From Reverence to Rape by the film critic Molly Haskell, and Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks by Donald Bogle. Let's start with Bogle. What's this book about?
This is an example of a book that I read when it came out. I think I actually bought it in hardcover. I think that he really just shifted the focus of Hollywood history by looking at it from an African American perspective. I mean, so crucial to America's identity and history and so on, and no one had really ever done this before. It's written from the perspective of a fan, which is to say that there's a lot of passion. I mean, he really loves movies, but he's also has a critical eye. I mean, I just think that it was that book was a kind of revelation. I think that Molly Haskell's book is something similar, From Reverence to Rape. I mean, Molly Haskell was a working film critic, also quite passionate, a real advocate for classic Hollywood, and writing in the 70s, which was the period of the so-called New Hollywood, when much more, let's say, adult movies were made. She takes this point of view, which was very radical, where she goes and she sees many progressive aspects particularly in terms of female stars in classic Hollywood, and points out that it's not, in this moment. I mean, the book is written, I think the Ms. magazine was founded in 71, 72, or 73. I mean, this is right after that, when feminism is an idea that's getting a lot of attention, and you would think that this attitude would be reflected in the movies, but she's taking the point of view that in fact it's not, that the movies of the post-code era, of the 60s and 70s are in some ways very retro, although, she does find stars to champion. I mean, Jane Fonda being sort of the exception who proves the rule. So I think that was an enormously influential book. And then the Navasky book, which comes out, a few years after that, goes back and recounts what to me is the most compelling of Hollywood backstories. And I say this because I myself am very interested in the ways in which Hollywood movies and American politics were in some sense symbiotic, and the connection, and I've written on that as well. But Navasky interviewed a number of writers and producers and so on who had been blacklisted, and also talked to the people who were responsible for implementing the blacklist. And it's another amazing way to look at film history when you see this other dynamic going on, this struggle within the industry. And I think that these three books together epitomize an attitude which they're political, but they see movies as a form of social history, or that social history is embedded in the history of the movies. And I think that was a very important way to look at them, and certainly affected my view at the time.
Some of the most popular in terms of best-selling books about Hollywood are, of course, celebrity memoirs, for better or for worse. And you don't have a lot on here. In fact, you only have one, and it's by Louise Brooks, Lulu in Hollywood. Why did that one make the cut?
Louise Brooks was not a household name. I mean, certain film historians and cinephiles and so on think that she's one of the greatest film actresses ever, and I wouldn't dispute that. She is pretty remarkable in a handful of movies that she made. But the thing is that she was a remarkably clear-eyed observer of what was going on, and embarked in the whole star-making thing with a healthy degree of ambivalence. And so she's able to write about herself and about the conditions under which movies were made and the people she met in Hollywood and so on in a way that's both personal and detached. There aren't too many other memoirs like this. Also, again, I would say that the quality of the writing is high. I mean, she was a really good writer and highly intelligent. And I don't want to unnecessarily disparage actors and so on, but most of these other books are ghostwritten. They're as told to. And I think that the fact that she found her own voice years after she had been a movie star is another remarkable thing about it. It occupies its own sphere.
All right, I'm going to lump the last three books together as sort of loosely being about the business. And we don't have time to talk about all three, but maybe we can talk about one of them. And those three books are 1960s The Stars by Edgar Morin, The Movie Moguls by Philip French from 1969, and a book we mentioned earlier, Easy Riders, Raging Bulls by Peter Biskind. Maybe tell us about one of those.
Well, I would like to mention The Stars by Edgar Morin, which is a book that came out well over half a century ago, and a book that I read, I think, maybe when I was an undergraduate. It is a relatively brief and elegant analysis of some of the greatest, most iconic stars, but also about their fans, and also about how they were marketed by the studio. And I found this a kind of revelation when I read it. I mean, it's quite poetic because he's completely comfortable discussing them as kind of divinities, which in a way they were. They could be every place at once. They seem to live forever. I mean, he's perfectly at home talking about a kind of religion that grew up among classic Hollywood, but he also is very astute at talking about sort of the material aspect of this. I mean, there is a fantastic chapter on James Dean, which I discovered much later actually was taken out of the book and ran in the Evergreen Review, which was sort of like the beatnik journal of record in the late 50s, early 60s, that really catches, what was going on and why he thought that Dean developed this kind of aura. So I just think it's a wonderful book. It did come back into print recently. That one was a great personal favorite of mine.
I'm sure you get asked all the time for recommendations on books about film. You've been doing this for a long time. What's the book you most frequently recommend to people if they're like, well, I just want to read like one book about the movies or about the industry, or what's the one book that I should read?
I taught film history to undergraduates at Cooper Union for a few decades. So I certainly have the book that I used to use as a history, and that's American-Made Movies by Robert Sklar, which is an incredibly readable, comprehensive, and intelligent history of American movies. Even he updated it a few times. It was published right around the same time as From Reverence to Rape in the mid-'70s. So that, I think, is the best single history of Hollywood, single popular history. I didn't include it in these books, though.
Why not?
Well, I wanted to keep something in reserve in case you asked me that question.
There we go. All right. Well, that makes it a good final question then. Tell us the title again of your next book and your most recent book.
The book that's coming out in the fall is Duck Soup. It's published by the British Film Institute. They have a whole series of monographs, which they've been doing for years. And the most recent book that I had published is Make My Day, Movie Culture in the Age of Reagan, which is the last installment of a trilogy of books about Hollywood in the Cold War, which deals with the intersection of movies and politics. And, of course, the culmination of that, in my view, is Reagan, the second-tier movie star come to power in the United States. So from the perspective of this series, Reagan is the ultimate Hollywood production.
Well, that was a lot of fun for me. I think as much fun for me to discuss, hopefully, as it was for you to put it together. Jim, thank you so much for being here.
Again, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Jim Hoberman is a film critic who this week put together a history of Hollywood in 9 books in the Book Review. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news in the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela. So this week there was a controversy surrounding the work of the author Ellen Hildebrand. She's a very popular author and known for her summer reads, and her latest novel, Golden Girl, takes place in Nantucket, where a lot of her work is set. And some of her readers, I would say not the majority, because she is a massively best-selling author and has a huge audience, but a small number of readers were offended by something that one of the characters says in the book, when one of the characters suggests that the other one hide out in the attic, and their teenage characters, they're girls, the character replies, like Anne Frank, and they both laugh. Some people found that remark by a fictional character to be insensitive, diminishing the Holocaust, and some even went so far as to call it anti-Semitic. But what was interesting, I think, in terms of how this impacts the publishing industry, where there's a lot of debate over who can write what and which topics are safe for authors and which ones should be off limits. What was interesting was the fact that Ellen Hildebrand responded by not only apologizing, but saying that they would delete the sentence from upcoming editions of the novel and take it out of the ebook. So you immediately saw a lot of very intense debate on social media, as debate on social media tends to be, with some people saying, this is going a little far.
A little far?
To not only look at what nonfiction writers are saying, what their views are, or how a fictional writer maybe portrays a character who's unlike themselves. These are all topics that have been intensely debated recently when you think about all the controversy surrounding American Dirt, which is a subject we've talked about a lot on this podcast. This was like somewhat of a different animal in terms of, just taking a specific phrase that a character said and then responding by taking it out of the book. So people who were originally offended think it's a good thing that she's responding to readers and taking, care to listen. But other people, including the literary critic Laura Miller, who wrote about this in Slate, feel like it's a dangerous precedent to sort of allow social media to be your editor and to go so far as to really react to the language of characters who are fictional.
Well, I have 1,000 things to say about this.
Oh, good.
And I feel free to say them because everyone should feel free to say what they want about anything, and everyone else should feel free to disagree with it or dislike it, but not to stop someone from speaking. So I want to say that, I do think that they are related, and that this is the kind of logical conclusion of that argument, that if you take an argument to an extreme, it often will highlight the absurdity of the original base argument. But the idea that a fictional character can't say something unlikable, insensitive, obnoxious would basically get rid of all the interesting characters in fiction. Because, good fiction is about complicated people, and everyone, even the most likable character, has opinions and characteristics that not everyone is going to agree with.
Exactly. And I think, sometimes that's a good way to introduce those arguments, is to have, a fictional character espouse views that most people would find offensive, and then that suddenly they're topics for discussion. The other thing I thought was notable about Hildebrand's response is that she posted a formal apology on Instagram. Then she said, I revere Anne Frank. Those of you who have read Summer of '69, another book of hers, know that Anne Frank was a courageous woman whom I revere. Her story remains deeply influential in my life. And then she said, I always strive to write in good faith. Golden Girl is a novel I wrote for my children, and I want them to be proud of every word. It was a pretty extensive and heartfelt apology, but I did wonder what happens the next time someone criticizes, if not her work, then, someone else in her genre who's very popular, who has a large following. Are people going to start retroactively changing their work? I just can't think of a precedent for this. It's common in nonfiction for people to address errors in their work. They'll have a corrected edition later if there are factual errors. It's much less common for novelists to change their work in response to criticism.
Well, I think it's a disturbing precedent. And I guess I'm sorry that she felt the need to apologize for a work of fiction. Hopefully other writers won't be pressured into feeling like they have to apologize for acts of imagination.
Yes, we'll see how it develops. It wasn't the only recent example, actually. Laura Miller wrote about another instance of a novelist deleting a passage after people criticized it. Again, a passage that was a quote from a fictional character. In this case, it was Casey McQuiston's Red, White, and Royal Blue, which is a gay romance novel. It actually came out in 2019, but some of the controversy came up recently, and it relates to a character's description of Netanyahu in Israel. And people said this seemed to cross a line, even though, again, this was dialogue that was coming out of the mouth of a fictional character.
Alexandra, I have a solution. All future novels will feature bunny rabbits, puppy dogs, and kittens.
I'm pretty sure you can get in trouble for talking animals too. I mean, I haven't heard of this yet, but...
And there's no barking, no barking, no biting, just friendly animals that eat vegetables. All right, Alexandra, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Andrew LaValle and Liz Egan. Hey there.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Andrew, let's start with you. It's been a while. What are you reading?
I am reading, actually, I just finished reading Liberty by Caitlin Greenidge. This is a novel that came out in March, and it's a coming-of-age novel, and coming-of-age novels are one of my sort of favorite types. This book is set just after the Civil War in New York, and is focused on a young Black woman named Liberty, whose mother is a doctor, which is an exceedingly rare thing for a Black woman to be at the time. The mother is light-skinned enough to pass, which Liberty is not, and in the early parts of the book, you see her becoming aware that some of the access and privilege her mother benefits from will not be available to her. But Liberty is also becoming aware that she just wants a different life. She goes off to school and discovers a passion for music, but she doesn't really like school either and flunks out. She eventually returns to her mother and becomes romantically involved with her mother's apprentice, who has taken her place. And because he is from Haiti, they get married and return there together. I thought the novel really came alive in this section because Liberty is experiencing the culture shock of a new country and people she doesn't know, along with the feeling that she still isn't finding the freedom that she longs for. But also her relationships with her husband and her mother, too, are still unfolding. And right up to the very end of the book, you see this character who is still sort of searching and changing.
It's interesting that this book came out so shortly after The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, and I'm sure people are making all kinds of comparisons, but just most directly in terms of that idea of the darker-skinned daughter of a mother who can pass as white.
You know, the character's awareness of how not just race, but color is affecting their lives and you know, will sort of affect their futures, I thought was really interesting.
Can we just pause also for a moment on the sisters Greenidge? Because Caitlin's sister, one of her sisters, Carrie, was a recent guest on the podcast, and there's a third Greenidge sister.
Yes, Kristen, who's a playwright. A really kind of amazing and like creative trio of sisters.
I know. I hope there's not like a little brother who, you know, never got off the ground. Because that's a pretty formidable grouping.
Yeah, definitely. Liz, what are you reading?
Actually, I just finished, so I'm kind of cheating, a book called Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which I predict will be one of the big books of the summer and is the perfect book to pick up if you're trying to get into the mindset of the season. It's hot sun, sandy feet, big waves, fresh seafood, gorgeous sunsets. It takes place, obviously, you might guess from the title, in Malibu. And the action unfolds over the course of 24 hours in 1983. I did actually read a review that referred to it as a historical novel, which I take issue with because I don't think of 1983 as necessarily...
It's very upsetting.
I know.
Very upsetting, this development.
Yes, I found that slightly hurtful because 1983 was pretty much my heyday. But the book is about 4 siblings who are the children of an absentee father named Mick Riva, who is a legendary crooner in the vein of Frank Sinatra. He actually makes an appearance in another one of Taylor Jenkins Reid's books called The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. But in this book, we are getting to know his 4 children who have kind of raised themselves in Malibu with the help of their oldest sister and / surrogate mother, whose name is Nina. And what we know at the beginning of the book is that the Rivas, who are young adults, are getting ready for this annual party that they throw. And it's the lead up to the party. And we also know that at the end of the party, Nina's house will burn down. There's a wildfire. Malibu is often catching on fire. And that's what you know going in. And then the story flashes back to the Riva kids growing up and trying to find their footing in the world as surfers and models and just trying to bring themselves up after their family falls apart. I would describe it, because I can never resist a Hollywood composite. I would describe it as Party of Five meets Soul Surfer meets This Is Us. And it's just a really in-depth look at these siblings and how they stick together and help each other out and undergo a big transformation from the beginning of the book till the end.
Along with that Hollywood composite, do you have thoughts on how you would cast this book?
Well, I picture Nina Riva, the oldest sibling, as a very young Cameron Diaz. She's kind of the only one. And of course, I was imagining Frank Sinatra in the role of Mick Riva. I can sort of imagine the movie itself, like it's this very sun-kissed landscape, very dry. And also the family owns a really popular restaurant on the Pacific Coast Highway. So you get these great scenes of them trying to save this restaurant as it's floundering a little bit, and sitting outside and eating these platters of, I was imagining fried clams. I can't remember exactly what, but it's a real page turner and it has a lot of heart. And I just loved it.
Andrew, you knew that Liz would have at least one cast member at the ready.
That's I knew she would.
For better or for worse. Pamela, what are you reading?
Before I go into what I'm reading, I just have to say that close listeners of the podcast will note that Liz just used the word crooner after Dwight and Parl and I discussed the word crooning in a recent episode. And crooner is also a good word. So I'm very glad that you used it. And you can't use it without thinking of Frank Sinatra. So all of that made sense to me.
Oh, good.
I also am going to talk about a book that I recently finished, and that is On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon-Reed. And of course, she was a guest on the podcast recently talking about this book, which I just loved. And it's a short book and a very timely book. It is June. And it's interesting, when she was on the podcast, she said that she used essays along the lines of those that were written by James Baldwin as a kind of model for this book. And it's very different from bigger, more researched historical books that she generally writes. And what's interesting is that one of the things I enjoyed most about this book is that she very persuasively and elegantly writes a defense of history into this book, in that what she's talking about, and the book is about the holiday Juneteenth, which originated in Texas. She's talking about her own personal history growing up in Texas, and she's talking about the history of Texas, and in particular as it pertains to race. And what she does in this book is talks about the complexity of all of those things, and the fact that what we would like to believe of our own personal history and of our larger, whether it's state history or national history, and the stories we tell ourselves about those things and the legends we create don't necessarily line up with the historical record. And so she can write about what she grew up believing and what her parents believed and what her ancestors thought and believed and liked to believe and hoped. And then the reality that is often a lot messier, and the fact that as a historian, she has to reconcile these things. So to give an example, many people in this country do tend to think of our history in terms of race as black and white. And of course, it's really not. There are so many other populations in this country, and it's a lot more complex, and it's complex within those white and black populations. And Texas is probably one of the most interesting cases because, of course, there are not just black and white, but Indigenous people and Mexican Americans and the early Texians, and the fact that Texas for a period was its own country. And so you just have these really interesting allegiances and alliances, but also antipathies that exist. So, for example, her father liked to believe that Indigenous Americans were naturally aligned with Black Americans. And so it was only as an adult that she realized that, in fact, many Indigenous people in Texas were slave owners. And so it was not this kind of kumbaya alliance between people of color, but in fact, was a lot messier. And so One of the things that she writes about in this book is that history doesn't always tell us the story that we want to hear or that we would like to believe or the story that will make us feel better, but is just a lot more complicated. And she just tells it in a kind of concise, it's almost like misleadingly plain spoken, but it's really well written and her words are chosen, I think, with great deliberateness. So it's accessible. And yet the themes and the issues that she writes about are pretty profound.
Pamela, how does she manage to squeeze everything you just said into a very short book, right? It's only a few hundred pages, right?
I don't even think it is. No, it's 141 pages.
Wow.
And so that's exactly it. It's concise, it's elegant. She tells a few key stories. This is not an autobiography or even fully a memoir, so much as it is a kind of series of interlinked essays that all build along these themes.
I will forever remember this book as one that I first saw in the hands of two unmasked people outside my bookstore having a conversation about the book. And it to me was a moment where I realized life is returning to normal. They were just two happy readers raving about the book to one another. And it just, I can't wait to read it. I thought that was the ultimate raving endorsement.
See, I got nervous when you said that because the point in time is so crucial for like the word unmasked. I'm like,
Oh, yes.
wait a minute, what they were not masked? This was post CDC. Okay.
Yes, it was legit. And it was outside.
Yes. Well, I will say it is short. It is very accessible. It is the kind of thing that you can sit down and read in a few hours and yet feel like you've gotten kind of enough to chew on for weeks.
It's so interesting, too, because I feel like at least for me over the past year, I've spent a lot of time learning about parts of American history that I didn't know about fully and feeling kind of self-conscious about it. It's almost comforting to see that historians are also kind of grappling with this. Like we're all kind of relearning a lot of things, especially over the past year.
I agree. And I think we were probably all taking U.S. history around the same time in high school and in different parts of the country. I'm appalled by the gaps in my own, what I thought of as a very thorough education. So if this year has taught us one thing, it's to go back and look again.
And you can start with at least two of the three books that we've discussed. Let's run down the titles again. Andrew, starting with you.
I'm reading Liberty by Caitlin Greenwich.
I'm reading Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid.
And I read Annette Gordon Reed's On Juneteenth. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.